This first lecture will be about the Future Perfect podcast, How to Prevent a Factory Farm Pandemic, featuring an interview with epidemiologist Martha Nelson of the National Institutes for Health and the Alliance for Democracy interview, Big Farms Make Big Flu, with another epidemiologist, Rob Wallace. Like those interviews, this lecture will cover a lot of factual information, none of which you need to remember exactly. It won't be on an exam, and you're not expected to cite this information in an assignment. Rather, the point is for you to get a general understanding of the pandemic risk of factory farms and to put this in the context of racist responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. While this first lecture is more about empirical information, the second lecture for this week will pose more philosophical questions, asking you to reflect on some of the issues and questions that are raised in the material covered so far. Dr. Nelson calls herself a scientist because she specializes in studying swine, or pigs, in agricultural settings. In particular, Dr. Nelson studies the threat of swine flus developing in farm settings that risk reaching epidemic or pandemic proportions. Swine flu, like COVID-19, is a zoonotic disease, or a zoonosis, which means that it can leap from non-human animals to humans. There was a time in the 19th century when tuberculosis was a big problem in Europe and was traced to humans drinking cow milk. This is discussed by sociologist Richie Nemo in his 2010 book, Milk, Modernity, and the Making of the Human, Purifying the Social. As Nemo explains, up until the 19th century, most people in Europe would not have drunk cow or other animal milk unless they lived on a farm. And even then, they would not have drunk much of it because the milk from mother animals mostly went to their babies. Today, we can only consume as much dairy as we do because calves are, for the most part, taken from their mothers, and many of them are killed for veal meat, while mother cows are bred to produce far more milk than they would naturally. In the 19th century, prior to this kind of selective breeding, milk would have been an uncommon beverage, and people living in cities would not have been able to drink cow milk at all, since there did not yet exist a way to transport milk from farms to cities without it spoiling. This only became possible with the invention of trains, refrigeration, and processes such as pasteurization, sterilization, and the standardization of milk. So, in the 19th century, drinking milk was a rather uncommon practice for many people, particularly in cities, and people were still suspicious of it. Milk drinking was associated with babies and nursing women, and was not considered something adults would drink, especially adult men. Drinking the milk of a non-human animal was also considered strange, since no other animals regularly drink the maternal milk of other species. The only kind of milk that it seemed normal for humans to drink was human milk, and that was only normal for babies. It was also known that wet nurses who relied on nursing other people's babies to survive would sometimes feed cow or other animal milks to their charges if their own milk dried up, or if they had taken in more babies than they could actually nurse. It was also known that mortality rates were high for those babies who were fed cow or goat milk, and this was one of the reasons why babies who were wet nursed away from the home were much more likely to die than babies who were nursed at home, whether by their mother or another woman. Prior to refrigeration, sterilization, and pasteurization, milk spoiled easily, was contaminated easily, and was associated with infant mortality, and so, for many good reasons, it was considered a dangerous and dirty food. With the inventions of trains and refrigeration, however, farmers began trying to create a market for dairy and sending it to the cities. Unfortunately for them, they then faced another problem with milk. People who were drinking it kept dying of tuberculosis. The evidence was clear that tuberculosis was being transmitted to humans by the milk, yet people found it hard to believe, and farmers denied it was possible, because they thought that the divide between humans and animals were too great to be breached by disease. Humans in the Judeo-Christian tradition were, after all, a creation apart from animals. As we now know, however, many types of infections, viruses, and diseases are zoonotic, and this is really not surprising since humans are, after all, animals. Speaking of the origins of COVID-19, Dr. Nelson notes that it is tempting to blame someone else, somewhere else, for the pandemic, and we don't want to look in our own backyards. As we've seen, since the outbreak of COVID-19, there has been a frenzy of blame against China, inflaming anti-Chinese racism. Donald Trump, for instance, insisted on calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus. You may have heard people expressing contempt for wet markets in China, or disgust for the kinds of animals being sold in these markets and that Chinese people will eat, such as the pangolin, who was probably infected with COVID-19 by a bat, which are also sold in Chinese markets. Christos Linteris and Lyle Fernley are two anthropologists who study disease in China, and they argue that the disproportionate focus on exotic food consumption that we see in media coverage of the origins of COVID-19 is often tinged with Orientalism and anti-Chinese sentiment. They state, in Western media, wet markets are portrayed as emblems of Chinese otherness, chaotic versions of Oriental bazaars, lawless areas where animals that should not be eaten are sold as food, and where what should not be mingled comes together, seafood and poultry, serpents and cattle. This fuels xenophobia. In Western news coverage, there has been a conflation of wet markets with live animal markets and exotic animal markets. In fact, wet markets are just markets where what is sold is primarily fish, meat, fruits, and vegetables, as opposed to dry, packaged foods. Not all wet markets sell live, wild, or exotic animals. In fact, many wet markets in Asia and other parts of the world resemble farmers' markets in the US and Canada. The main difference is that, like a market you may see in a Canadian or American Chinatown, a lot more people shop in such markets in other countries, and the markets are a source of affordable, fresh food. In contrast, North American farmers' markets are often expensive and bourgeois, usually found in gentrified, middle-class, primarily white neighborhoods like Old Strathcona and Westmount in Edmonton. There has been a lot of talk about banning wet markets since SARS and again since COVID-19. But what people really seem to want to ban are markets where live animals, including wild animals, are sold and slaughtered. These are not, in fact, unique to China or even to Asia, but are common in many parts of the world, and many low-income people globally rely on them for access to food, which is why outright bans on wet markets have proved difficult to enforce. It is true that there are particular dangers that come from eating wild animals because humans have not had the chance to develop immunities to the pathogens that these animals may carry. It is also true that there is a particular risk of transmission between animals in live animal markets, where different kinds of animals are stacked on top of each other in cages, often in dying conditions, bleeding, urinating, defecating, and salivating on one another. Eating wild animals has resulted in pandemics and epidemics like SARS and Ebola that, like COVID-19, were traced to humans eating wild animals or bushmeat who had themselves been infected by virus-carrying bats. So, live, wild animal markets and the bushmeat trade really do pose serious pandemic threats, and they do involve cruelty to animals, and millions of poor people around the world rely on them for food and income. Experts have argued that simply banning the sale of wild animals without ensuring alternate means of sustenance and income to the millions of people who rely on this trade would result in an expansion in the illegal trade in wild animals, including species that are already on the brink of extinction. Such outright bans, without measures such as government subsidies, could therefore make matters worse rather than better. I don't so much want us to debate the ethics of wild or live animal markets, however, or the politics and pragmatics of banning them. What I want us to question is the implicit assumption that the ways that meat, eggs, and dairy are produced in North America and Europe are any less cruel than the markets that sell live or wild animals, and that we could never have a pandemic like COVID-19 originate in North American or European farms, or in the eating of what Westerners consider normal animals, like cows, pigs, turkeys, and chickens. As Nelson says, it's really easy to think about pandemics as foreign invaders coming from other people who are doing things in a bad way. However, there have been numerous pandemics and epidemics that originated in the factory farms of North America and Europe, and in the North American style of industrial farming that has been exported globally. One example of a zoonotic disease that derived from industrialized agriculture and from factory farms in the West is so-called mad cow disease, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or, since that's hard to say, BSE for short. When BSE spreads to humans, it's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. BSE originated in industrialized agriculture in England, where farmers were feeding meat and bone meal that included remnants from cattle to cows, so cattle was being fed to other cattle, despite cattle being herbivores, and despite this being cannibalism. The unnatural feeding of cattle to other cattle resulted in a neurodegenerative disease called BSE. As you may know, there was a BSE crisis in Alberta in 2003-5, which resulted in the US and around 40 other countries closing their borders to Canadian beef exports. In December of 2003, BSE was detected in the US, and a DNA test traced it back to Albertan cattle. This resulted in years of litigation around bans on Canadian meat and billions of dollars in government financial aid to Canadian cattle farmers. BSE was again found in an Albertan farm in 2015, so Canada has had its own zoonotic disease outbreak and is guilty of exporting it internationally. We can also take the example of avian influenza, also called avian flu or bird flu, which is considered a potential pandemic threat. The transmission of diseases from birds to humans is relatively rare. However, the mortality rate for humans who catch some kind of avian influenza, such as H5N1, is as high as 60%, much higher than COVID-19. In the case of another avian influenza, H7N7, infected poultry do not die, but a fifth of humans who caught the avian influenza did die. Imagine if an avian flu with one of these kinds of mortality rates were to be more contagious for humans and were to reach pandemic levels. This would be a much greater threat than COVID-19. The most virulent types of avian influenzas are called HPA1, or highly pathogenic avian influenza. There have been virulent strains of avian influenza in many countries across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and North America, including Canada. Some have originated in small backyard farms, but the majority have originated in poultry farms that are industrialized according to the North American factory farm model. Although there have been recorded cases since the late 19th century of what used to be called fowl plague, F-O-W-L plague, the vast majority of avian flus have occurred since the 1990s, with some outbreaks involving millions of birds and some human fatalities. Why have bird flus become so much more common since the 90s? The answer is that since the 1990s, the number of birds farmed grew by 76% in so-called developing countries and by 23% in so-called developed or overdeveloped countries. It is the intensity and density of the way that birds are now farmed that explains the great increase in cases of avian flus around the world. Avian flus in wild birds are mild and have little opportunity to be transmitted to humans. Avian flus in factory farms, however, have an environment in which they can mutate to become more deadly. This is because when you have thousands of birds together in one building, you can have more than one strain of influenza present at the same time, and then one animal is likely to become infected with two strains at the same time. Then, when the two strains of influenza are in the same animal, they can swap genes, and in the process, you can get a more deadly variant of influenza. As Rob Wallace stresses, the homogeneous genetics of birds in industrialized agricultural settings also makes it particularly easy for avian flus to spread. There are no differences between the birds, such as different genetic immunities, that might prevent some of them from becoming infected. This means that entire flocks can be wiped out within 28 hours. Avian flus in factory farm settings also have the opportunity to be transmitted to humans easily, since humans are handling the bodies, feathers, body fluids, and excrement of the birds during slaughter and plucking, and because humans are touching contaminated surfaces and equipment. On top of that, because the industrial agricultural model involves transporting birds across the country and also around the world on planes, it is very easy for a zoonosis that originates in a factory farm in one country to become a global threat very quickly. We have seen with COVID-19 that the risk of transmission is greater when we are inside. That's why experts predicted a surge with the coming of winter when we're all inside more. The same is true for avian flus. More transmissions occur when the birds are kept inside and when humans are inside with the birds, which is characteristic of factory farming. Similar accounts can be given of swine flu or swine influenza as avian flus. Swine flus reached pandemic proportions in 1918, the so-called Spanish flu, and again in 2009 to 2010. The swine flu of 2009 to 10 was an H1N1 virus that combined North American swine influenza, North American avian influenza, human influenza, and 2 swine influenzas typically found in Asia and Europe. It infected up to 1.4 billion people worldwide, which was 21% of the global population in 2010, although, as in the case of COVID-19, many people were asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, so it's hard to know exact numbers, and it was not a very lethal strain of flu. Although none of these factory-farmed pandemics or epidemics has yet to reach the proportions of COVID-19, what both Martha Nelson and Rob Wallace are warning us is this is only coincidental. It is only because the factory farm derived pandemics and epidemics have so far happened to involve less lethal or less contagious strains of a virus than COVID-19. There is no guarantee, however, that some future strain of avian flu or swine flu or the next cattle disease will not lead to a pandemic as serious or more serious than COVID-19. As Nelson and Wallace both explain, it would, in fact, be very easy for one of the zoonotic diseases that have originated in Western or Western-style factory farms to reach a pandemic level in the near future. As Nelson puts it, the factory farm is the perfect environment for brewing up a monster virus, and we are currently playing Russian roulette with our chances of creating just such a virus.